Well, what I'd like to do in these last couple of videos is just speak to some of the questions that may have arisen around the fact that as a church, during this time of lockdown, why are we not trying somehow to celebrate or enact communion? Now, there are two conceivable ways that this could happen that you might have heard of. One of them is a kind of cyber communion setup where everybody in their own homes would have bread and wine, and everybody would log on, and I would live stream a celebration of communion. When we get to the bit where normally we would hand out the bread and wine, what actually happens is that everybody scattered throughout Ipswich would take their own little bread and wine, and we'd all eat it together. And in some sense, that would be trying to capture something of what communion is about. Well, I'm going to look at that sort of cyber communion idea in the next video. What I want to do in this video is just think through very, very briefly the guidance that has come out from the Church of England that around the idea of something called spiritual communion. Now, you can go online onto the Church of England website and read that guidance for yourself. But in a nutshell, the basic idea is that there, some bishops or some members of the clergy might choose to celebrate communion, perhaps with one or two members of their own household, and that other people could kind of log on and watch that being live streamed. And even though they're not able to receive the bread and wine for themselves, that they can still engage with it through this thing called this act of spiritual communion. Here's what the guidance actually says. The term spiritual communion has been used historically to describe the means of grace by which a person, prevented for some serious reason from sharing in a celebration of the Eucharist, nonetheless shares in the communion of Jesus Christ. The guidance goes on to say that the Book of Common Prayer instructs us that if we offer ourselves in penitence and faith, giving thanks for the redemption won by Christ crucified, we may truly eat and drink the body and blood of our Savior Christ, although we cannot receive the sacrament physically for ourselves. Now, given that is guidance from the Church of England, and hey, they even quote the Book of Common Prayer, why are we not looking to do this in MIE? Well, first of all, I find it hard to escape the sense that to do this would be a return to the kind of medieval Catholicism that the Church of England was reacting against when it went through its Reformation. Back then, and if you went right back to maybe the 13th, 14th, 15th century, the congregation, they wouldn't receive the communion. They might receive the bread, but would certainly never receive the wine. And to be fair, often they wouldn't receive the bread. All they needed to do was be present. They didn't even have to give it their attention necessarily. They were able just to turn up into church and sit and chat with their friends or whatever, while the priest up at the front of the church celebrated the Mass. There's some really entertaining anecdotes from the Reformation times, both here and in Europe, of when the church had been reformed, and there was this I think much more biblical idea that the congregation are deeply involved in and are expected to be engaged in the sacramental life of the church. That actually there were all kinds of problems because people were still just turning up and sitting and chatting and didn't understand why that was a problem. That's what they'd always done, right? They weren't expected to actually engage or take part in or receive the bread and the wine for themselves. And it's interesting, the Church of England actually has in its articles a very specific refutation of the idea that the clergy should celebrate communion while the laity, the congregations, shouldn't participate in receiving both the bread and the wine. You see, I think there are really significant theological and spiritual issues at work here about what we think is actually going on as we celebrate communion together. Now, in the sermon and a bunch of stuff that's on the website, and in the last couple of videos, I've tried to lay out something of what the Church of England teaches. And I think the Church of England's teaching on communion is richly biblical. I don't want to revisit that here. Just to say that the Lord's Supper is the remembrance of a meal in which we are all supposed to share. Right? It's not something that's done on our behalf by some specialized group within the life of the church. By its very nature, it is something that we all participate in. Though we are many, we are one body because we all share in the one bread. So, what do we do then with the Book of Common Prayer's allowance for this spiritual communion? Does that exist? It does. There is a part of the service for taking communion to the sick. And this, it's called a rubric. This direction is actually embedded there as part of the Book of Common Prayer. I think it's pastorally, it's a very important rubric. But let me say just a couple of things about it. The first is that it assumes that the church family is meeting to celebrate communion, and that there is someone, like an individual, who is genuinely unable to attend or to receive even a visit from the minister or someone else who's been licensed by the bishop to share a home communion. Now, the Book of Common Prayer says that could be because of extremity of sickness, or want of warning in due time, or for the lack of company to receive communion with them, or any other just impediment. Now, I'll be honest, I'm sure there are church lawyers somewhere who'll tell me I'm wrong on this, but it feels to me quite disingenuous then to apply that to a situation where a priest is celebrating communion in a context where no one else can attend in principle. Now, the second thing I'd want to say about it is this, and I think this is much more significant. The same rubric or the same instruction to the clergy in this part of the Book of Common Prayer states very clearly that the minister may have communion on their own with someone in their home, quotes, during time of plague, sweat, or such other like contagious times of sickness and disease. All right, page 325, Book of Common Prayer, the communion of the sick. You can read it for yourself. You see, the rubric that's being cited in this active spiritual communion guidance actually tells me as a minister what I should do in a situation exactly like the one we are in at the moment. That irrespective of the risk of infection, the minister is to celebrate communion with someone who is sick, someone who is unable to join with the rest of the church in communion, and to do it with that person on their own if necessary. And if you read my emails a few days ago on Cranmer's homily on exhortation against the fear of death, you'll understand why he felt ministers could and should be able to do that. And actually it's that the bishops have expressly withheld their permission for ministers to do. If we were to do something that had me sitting here or standing here celebrating communion while you watched on, my own conviction is that any sense of spiritual comfort would be without biblical warrant. I think there are really genuine biblical concerns here. I think we can trust the sovereignty and the providence of God for this time when we are not able to receive the Lord's Supper together. God knows the situation we're in, and I'll look at this again in the next video, and He's able to feed and sustain His people during a time such as this. He will not allow us to spiritually starve, even if we can't share the Eucharistic bread and wine together. But the idea that the clergy can continue to receive communion in some way while their congregations can't, I think is deeply problematic. My hope is, my prayer is, that during this time of kind of Eucharistic famine, that actually the Spirit would increase our hunger and thirst for communion. Now, I think in recognition of a lot of this, the Church of England guidance also advocates that priests may abstain from communion whilst it is not possible under current guidance for their congregations to receive it with them. Now, I think that is much more in line with the Scripture's teaching and with the teaching of the Book of Common Prayer. And it is the line that I've taken, and it is the line that I've taken since the cup was first withheld from congregations. It was only a few weeks ago, but it seems like a lifetime ago, doesn't it? Let me come back in the next video and talk about the question of cyber communion, and also address the question of one of the things that God might be doing in withholding communion from us as a church at this time.